Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Lulu Raczka's play Antigone. I think I'm pronouncing the last name Raczka correctly. I'm not 100% sure though. But this is a really, really cool Antigone adaptation. Because my slightly perhaps unorthodox or maybe unpopular position is that I don't especially care for Antigone, the character. I don't like. I get why so many people like Brecht and Anu and all these different authors, Osafison and these others, identify her as a symbol of resistance against authoritarianism. But I kind of think she's terrible in a way. In really the same way that Creon is terrible. And what I really like about Raczka's version, this is a complete re-envisioning of how this play works. Ismani is much more central in this version. It's a two-person play, actually. It's just Antigone and Ismani. And so Ismani is much more central to the plot. And I think that's really, really important because to me, Ismani is the most interesting and most important character, in part because she's the one who doesn't have a tragic story, really. Like, out of all of the people in the House of Laius, she's the only one who doesn't end tragically. I mean, Laius does, Jocasta does, Oedipus does, Eteocles and Polynices both do. Antigone obviously does. Ismene doesn't. And so I think she's super, super interesting and super, super important. But she's also an interesting figure here in her own right. So the play starts actually really interestingly. We have stage directions. It says, the stage is covered in dirt. Dirt you could lose yourself in, as someone has. As two girls rise out of it, two teenage girls. They familiarize themselves with their surroundings, the stage, the audience, the dirt covering their bodies. They wash themselves off and wash each other. This is solemn. Until they look at each other, and then they can't keep it up. They start to giggle. They laugh. And then flick water at each other. They get up and start to dance. A stupid, fun dance. Part little girl, part sexy. The older girl, Antigone, does the sexy parts well. She knows what she's doing. Ismani, the younger girl, doesn't quite understand. She's either awkward or naively innocent, not understanding the insinuation behind her movements. But whatever it is, they dance, they have fun, and soon return to laughing. So that's a super cool opening, for a couple of reasons. One is that we get these characters presented in a totally different way than we do in the Sophocles version. Because in the Sophocles version, basically the first introduction we get to Antigone and Ismani as characters is discussing the death of their brother. Of their brothers, both brothers technically, but Polynices more, because he's the one who's unburied. So Sophocles doesn't give us the sense that these are characters outside of this particular plot line necessarily. Like, they are there to set Antigone up to bury Polynices and to be killed for it. Raczka gives us a completely different opening. And we follow this dancing, this like sisterly playing with like flicking water at each other and stuff like this. With this game, the answer is always yes, is this game. Like, Antigone will make some statement and Ismani has to answer yes, or she has to drink. it's the kind of game that you might play if you're siblings and you're bored. But what it does that's really interesting is it creates these characters as regular people who have regular desires. Like, they want to go to bars and they want to interact with people. They want to have relationships and so on and so on, which we don't get in Sophocles. They're not really people in the Sophocles version. They are tragic figures, and that there's a huge difference there. So Raczka sets that up really, really well. But the other thing that's cool about the opening, Antigone is fundamentally a play concerned with burial, right? I mean, the key conflict is over Antigone burying Polynices' body. To start the play by having Antigone and Ismani rise up from the dirt, as though resurrected, as though brought back to life from the dead, is really, really cool. Not only because it kind of reverses the burial of Polynices that's so central to the play, but also in the sense that these characters are being resurrected from the Sophocles version. I mean, Antigone dies in Sophocles, but also we have that play, so there's a sort of narrative death. They are stuck within that play. And Raczka, by adapting the play and by creating these characters anew, particularly by making them more like real people, regular people, Raczka is bringing them back to life, giving them a new lease on life, almost. I think it's really, really fascinating. So we go on, and actually, this is about 125 pages. The text starts on page 7, so call it 118 or so pages. The first 45 pages or so is actually, very little of it is actually about Polynices. Eteocles and Polynices don't even die until almost a third of the way in. The whole first third of the play is devoted to establishing Antigone and Ismani as real people with real desires, normal experiences that they want to have. So, like, we have this extended portion where Ismani talks about her fantasy of how she wants to fall in love with someone. Like, she'll be carrying a stack of books, he'll be carrying a stack of books, they'll crash into each other, they'll start apologizing, and then they'll, like, look into each other's eyes and fall in love. Antigone then gives us... So Antigone has grown up with Haemon, knowing that he's the one that she's going to marry, etc., etc. So that's, I mean, she's never had that meeting the person you fall in love with moment. And she has this extended fantasy where she and Haemon had been separated basically as babies. And they grow up knowing that the other is out there, but not knowing how to reach out, etc., etc. And they grow up and they have lives. Like, they get married, they have children with other people. And then something happens. There's a car crash, basically. They hit a deer on the road. And they get out. And they, even before they can see clearly who the other person is, they just know that's the other. Haemon knows it's Antigone, and Antigone knows it's Haemon, and they fall in love in that moment. And it's a fascinating thing, but it's very, very different. It's not a sentiment that we ever get in Sophocles. Like, we can take Antigone's word for it in Sophocles that she loves Haemon, but there's not much there. Like, there's no indication that she wants to have a life with him or plans to have a life with him. Here we get much more of that developed. But there's also a lot of there's what I would call critique of Antigone in this play. And that's, for me, the other real big difference from Sophocles. Sophocles hints at it a little bit with Ismani and Haman, who are like, hey, maybe don't fucking go to the extreme, Antigone. But that's not really that central to Sophocles' version. For Sophocles, the conflict is Antigone versus Creon. Here, Creon is really, really in the background. And the conflict is between Antigone and Ismene. And it largely centers on Antigone's intransigence, her absolute dedication to doing the thing that she thinks is right, no matter what. And Ismene calls her out for this. So there's discussion about whether or not Antigone cares what other people think of her. And Antigone claims that she doesn't. And Ismene says, you care, but it's not like it upsets you. You like it. You love it. You love being this rebel, this outlaw, this person that everyone thinks is a monster. You love it. Everyone being scared of you, being all righteous, lording it over everyone. And then a little bit later, she says, she compares this to, like you loved telling that barman he was wrong. And that, for clarity, that's a reference to something that had happened earlier in the play, where they go to this bar. The bartender refuses to serve them because they're the sisters of Polynices, and he's leading the war against Thebes. And Antigone tells him, and this is an interesting thing, actually. Antigone is basically like, it doesn't matter what he's doing because my brother is a good man. He must be doing it for a good reason. She doesn't know. She's not really concerned with what the reason is. She just has this blind faith. So that's what Ismani is referencing here. She says, like you loved telling that barman he was wrong. Antigone says, he was saying awful things. Ismani says, and you knew he would. You went there because you knew. You wanted him to hate you and stand there being hated. And Antigone says, yes, I did like defending my brother. And Ismene says, it's not about him, it's about you. So this is really kind of my problem with Antigone at the end of the day, is there are things that she could do to remain true to her principles and still not die, still not leave Haman by himself, still not leave Ismene by herself. There are things that she could do that would be more socially and interpersonally responsible than what she does without compromising her principles. But she's unwilling to make any sort of compromise whatsoever. And I don't like that as a character. I don't like it in Creon. I don't like it in Antigone. To me, Ismene and Haman are right. And so we get that articulated much more clearly here. But we also get a lot more information about Ismene as a character. And again, I love Ismene. So I'm super, super pleased with this. So, for instance, at shortly after they learn that Polynices has died, so the soldiers drag Polynices' body to just outside the city gates, and they dump it. They're closing the gates. Antigone runs towards them, crashes into them, into the closed gates. She tries to get through. And Ismani reflects, talking to the audience. She says, "She looks back toward me, but I don't follow. I stay here. I can't tell her this. I can never tell her this. But what I feel is the worst feeling in the world. I feel relief." So this is relief at the death of her brother Polynices. And it's totally understandable. Like, that's the thing, is Polynices and Eteocles are not good. As far as we can tell, they aren't particularly concerned about anybody but themselves. They're not especially good rulers of Thebes. They have no real redeeming qualities, as far as I can tell from all of the plays that I've read in which Eteocles and Polynices appear. They seem generally just to be selfish idiots who are willing to have wars to get the throne of a city-state that they don't have that much interest in really ruling well anyway. So the fact that they are such destructive people, and they know that they're going to be destructive, like, there is prophecy that says, you're going to kill each other. Neither of you will win, neither of you will succeed. They know this, and they do it anyway. Like, it's totally realistic and totally understandable to be like, on some level, I'm glad that he's died, because he was not a good person. He was a net negative for the world. So I like that aspect of it. And again, I think that's very, very human, in a way that Sophocles' characters aren't necessarily, because they aren't meant to be. And that, I mean, part of that is the Greek tragedians were not doing any sort of psychological realism or something like this. And I mean, Raczka's play is not realist. It's not naturalistic. I mean, again, it's two people and they are recounting their experiences. They will sometimes take on the persona of other people, etc., etc. But they're fleshed out human beings. The other thing that we get, the last scene, about 13 pages long, is a monologue by Ismani after Antigone has died. And she's largely lost. She just sort of drifts through things. Like, she's capable of doing well in school, but she often doesn't apply herself. She has friends and loses friends, and she doesn't have a job. She doesn't have much interest in doing anything in particular. She tries to have affairs. We have this very somewhat graphic description where she tries to seduce this random guy, but he's got PTSD from the war, and because she's Polynices' sister, he hates her as well, and all this stuff, and so he can't get it up, and all this stuff goes on. But like, her life is just sort of drifting for the most part. And then she meets somebody and gets married and has children with him, and because she's busy, she has kind of a purpose, but people continue dying, etc., etc. And so one of the things at the very end that I find really interesting, she says, "Soon after, my husband joins them all." That's everybody who's dead. Her entire family. Haemon is dead by this point, etc., etc. Soon after, my husband joins them all. Joins her, my dad, my mom, and our brothers. My kids struggle. I try to help them. I've been there. But they don't believe me. They see themselves as the first people to ever experience it. I let them believe it. Once again, I'm alone in a big house. And I'll join them all soon. But I'm scared to join them. How can I face her? I don't understand. And so the last bit, I don't understand, that's a reference to something that Antigone had said earlier in the play, that, because basically Antigone defined adulthood, or her adulthood at least, as when you commit to something, you must absolutely commit to it, and you cannot waver. Which personally I think is a terrible definition of adulthood. I think it's a dreadful definition of adulthood. You should be able to change your mind if circumstances change. But one of the things I find really, really interesting about this ending, because again, I'm fascinated by Ismene, what actually happens to Ismene in the Greek myths is she's murdered. I forget if it's a husband or just a lover or whatever it is, but she's murdered by a dude for no particular reason. Like, it's just... So again, that's the thing. It's like everybody else in her family, Laius, Jocasta, Oedipus, Antigone, Eteocles, and Polynices, they all have these tragic deaths. Haemon has this tragic death to a certain extent. Ismene doesn't. She's just killed, and no one seems to give a fuck in Greek mythology. It's like she's a footnote that, yes, some guy killed her at some point after the Antigone, after the events of Sophocles' Antigone. Somebody killed her. And that's it. And I find that dreadfully sad. But I in a way, find it more sad the way that Raczka has reimagined Ismene's ending. This idea that she ends up alone, which is actually quite appropriate, because in the myth she ends up alone. She's the last of her family because Antigone refuses to just be like, I'm gonna let it go. Like, Antigone chooses death over remaining with Ismene. And in Raczka's version, Ismene directly says that. But that idea that Ismene ends up alone, I think, is appropriate but also terribly sad.